Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer, and today's video is another in our continuing series entitled Fundamentals You Should Know. Today I want to talk about a frustration that brokers often have, and it's not actually surprising at all, when they timely and properly terminate a purchase and sale agreement using a contingency benefiting a buyer, a contingency provided through the statewide form system, and take that termination notice to escrow asking for a release of the earnest money, only to hear escrow respond with something along the lines of, "We can't release earnest money until you bring us a rescission agreement." Frustrating to brokers because brokers are reading the boilerplate language on the statewide form contingency form, and the language says, for example, with respect to the inspection contingency, that the purchase and sale agreement on the Form 35R, purchase and sale agreement is terminated and the earnest money shall be returned to buyer. Buyer's broker knows that they timely obtained buyer's signature on Form 35R, timely delivered the Form 35R to listing broker and listing firm, and so buyer's broker knows that they've done everything they were supposed to do in order to terminate the transaction and recover the earnest money, and yet escrow is saying, you have to bring us a rescission agreement. So what's driving that? Well, the answer is escrow is, in concept, entirely right with the demand that escrow is making. Oftentimes, escrow will in fact ask for a rescission agreement, and they don't really need a rescission agreement. The truth is, when buyers signed the Form 35R and it was timely and properly delivered to the listing broker and the listing firm, that did in fact terminate the purchase and sale agreement. The purchase and sale agreement does not need to be rescinded because it's already been terminated. And if the purchase and sale agreement has been terminated, then there's nothing left to rescind. So escrow is misplaced in its use of the word rescission agreement. What escrow actually needs is a Form 50. And I wholly endorse and support escrow companies asking for a Form 50, a disbursement of earnest money, prior to releasing the earnest money in a situation like the one we described. Why? I want you to think about escrow's position in this transaction. Escrow is a third party to this transaction with a fiduciary duty to both buyer and seller. That means that if the earnest money truly belongs to seller, they would have a fiduciary duty violation if they release the earnest money to the buyer, and vice versa. If the money really belongs to the buyer and they release it to the seller, they've breached their fiduciary duties. That's a big deal. So escrow says, we can't take that kind of risk unless there's good reason to take that risk. I want you to think about escrow's position in this particular transaction. We now have a sale-failed transaction. It's not going to close. If the transaction doesn't close, how much is escrow going to make on this transaction? The answer to that question is nothing. Escrow is going to receive zero compensation for this transaction. With that in mind, how much risk do you think escrow should assume in releasing that money to either buyer or seller? And the answer from a business perspective is zero risk. They're receiving zero compensation. They should take on zero risk. What's the only way for escrow to avoid all risk in a sale-failed transaction where one of the parties is claiming earnest money? The answer to that question is escrow has to receive written instructions from both parties agreeing to the release of the earnest money. The statewide form for that purpose is Form 50, disbursement of earnest money. Buyer brokers don't react negatively to the escrow company or the escrow agent that says we need a Form 50 or even a Form 51 rescission agreement if they're misplaced in their understanding of that form. Instead, understand their position, go out and get a Form 50, disbursement of earnest money, signed by the buyer and seller, deliver it to escrow. I guarantee you escrow will release the earnest money to your buyer if that's what the Form 50 says. So then the next problem brokers encounter, and the reason that they're probably opposed to getting that Form 50 in the first place, is because the seller won't sign the Form 50. That's a completely different issue and a completely different problem, and certainly it's one that brokers encounter frequently When a seller, maybe because they're just being obstinate, maybe they have an actual disagreement with the buyer as to who's entitled to the earnest money, maybe they're just an absentee seller and now that the sale has failed, they don't care about this buyer anymore and they're not interested in signing something. If seller won't sign a Form 50 and your buyer knows that they're entitled to the earnest money and you're confident the buyer's entitled to the earnest money, perhaps the best thing for the buyer to do is to file a demand, a written demand for release of the earnest money to the escrow company. That will trigger the statutory process that escrow must then follow that will ultimately lead to either release of the earnest money or interpleader of the earnest money. I put this whole video in the context of buyer being the party entitled to earnest money. Everything I've said is essentially the same if seller is entitled to the earnest money. If seller is entitled to the earnest money and escrow says we need a rescission agreement, what they really mean is they need a Form 50 earnest money, disbursement of earnest money. Listing broker, go get that form signed. If buyer won't sign it, then seller should make written demand on the escrow company, triggering the statutory process for release of the earnest money. If you have questions on this topic or any other, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.